Hello, friends. I'm so happy to be able to join you for this discussion. Wish I could be there in person. Hopefully, we can make that happen soon. The overarching theme for my presentation will be that the pandemic has exposed and deepened pre-existing rifts within American society, within U.S. society. So I'm going to start with a brief outline of those rifts. I will then look at the pandemic itself, the handling of the pandemic and some of its effects on American society, on U.S. society. I will also talk about the independent but intertwined discussion of racism within American society that was accelerated by the murder of George Floyd last May in Minneapolis. And I want to talk about how these dynamics, both the pandemic and the discussion of race, played out in our national elections last fall. And then finally, I want to wrap up with a little reflection on how these dynamics are playing out in the present. So first of all, it is no secret, you know this well, that U.S. society has been deeply divided along race, class, party ideological lines, and regionally as well, and this was true well before the pandemic. We did have a brief fantasy period after the election of Barack Obama in 2008 that we had entered what some called a post-racial or a colorblind society, but that illusion was really ripped away by a series of police killings of Black Americans. Maybe only the most celebrated or notable, not celebrated in the positive sense, but recognized was the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. In addition to racial divides within this society, we have been experiencing long-term economic shifts for decades that have created the widest wealth inequalities, perhaps in our nation's history, and these in particular are not distributed equally across region. So the geographic middle of our country, what we call the Midwest, and especially the upper Midwest, had been for most of the 20th century the industrial heartland where most of our manufacturing was located, the car business, for example, and as a consequence of deindustrialization itself brought about by free trade policies and the outsourcing of jobs and capital on the one hand. On the other hand, by the rise of automation, the gradual replacement of physical manual labor by humans with machines, all of these led to a sort of a collapse of manufacturing and industry in the so-called industrial heartland, and the impact of this was increasing poverty, addiction, and basically challenging life circumstances, especially on white working class Americans, those with up to high school education, but not beyond that. Meanwhile, on the two coasts, things were different. We had finance on the East Coast and high tech or high technology on the West Coast. Of course, in both those two places, within those regions, in the coasts, there is substantial inequality. But still, there were plenty of people who were doing very, very well. California, for example, were it an independent nation and not a state, would have the fifth largest economy in the world. So plenty of people in the two coasts were doing quite well, whereas people in the middle of the country were not doing so well. We're having a struggle. And this gave rise to a sort of a political map in which the Democratic Party, represented by the color blue, dominated the coasts, and then the center of the country, almost from coast to coast, everything in between was dominated by the conservative Republican Party, represented by the color red. So if you looked at a political map of the United States, you see blue and blue on the two coasts, and you'd see red in the middle. This situation gave rise to the notion of the coastal elites, which is a term of resentment, basically, about the wealth concentration on the coasts, and then the phrase flyover states, those being the states in the middle of the country that the movers and shakers in society would simply fly over and never really stop, because there was nothing of interest, nothing of consequence going on in those states. So we had these political regional class divides that were already quite entrenched well before the pandemic. Now, turning to the pandemic itself. It was clear from the outset that President Trump's approach to the virus was to minimize, deny, deflect, and devolve. Minimize in the sense of, saying, only 15 people have the disease. Deny, for example, that the death rates that were being reported were in fact accurate. Deflect in the sense of blaming this on China, the Kung flu or the China virus, as he frequently said. And then devolve in the sense of devolve responsibility for effective response to the crisis to the states, and just to leave the federal government as if it had no capacity or no role in addressing the crisis. Now, the obvious reason for this was that President Trump believed that the booming economy, and the economy had been, in fact, booming before the pandemic struck, that was his ticket to re-election, and he didn't want to jeopardize his chances, and he knew that any economic shutdown, which might be necessary to effectively address the pandemic, would inflict harm on his political odds. Behind the scenes, of course, it's clear that his administration invested heavily in developing the vaccines, and to his administration's credit, they succeeded in a vastly accelerated production of what, at least for the time being, seemed to be highly effective and highly safe vaccines. You all know it is I think a well understood fact that no disaster is fully natural. The impacts are always differentially distributed within society, and poor and vulnerable people are the ones who suffer the most. So it was with this pandemic. Many people lost. There was great economic dislocation. There was death on a very, very significant scale, something approaching 600,000 people in this country. Others, however, actually benefited from the pandemic, some of them immensely. Generally speaking, those who suffered most were those whose work entailed contact with the public, so restaurants, music, and the like, and or frontline workers, grocery store people, hospital workers, others who had to remain in their workplace in order to deal with and address fundamental, essential needs. So those were the people who suffered. And by the way, of course, there is a coincidence of race and class and employment in this country. So most of those people who were suffering the impacts at differential rates were people of color, black people, Latinos, other minorities. Meanwhile, the rest of us knowledge workers, essentially anybody who worked at a computer keyboard, managed fine. The stock market remained robust. Online delivery companies flourished. Jeff Bezos, already the richest man in the world, the CEO of Amazon, is said to have increased his net wealth by $32 billion last year. After some disruption to daily routine, us knowledge workers found that online work actually had many advantages. We didn't have to commute through heavy traffic to our jobs. The biggest challenge was daycare for kids, for people, knowledge workers who had school-age children. And so there was a sort of a side political battle over school openings. Kids, as you know, are relatively less vulnerable to the virus, but those who taught them and, school administrators, janitors, food servers, and the like, all were vulnerable. So it was a genuine dilemma that cut across political boundaries, other ideological boundaries between the right and left, between the Democrats and the Republicans. And it was a sort of a complicated local level discussion over when to open schools. On the light side, on the positive side, I think for lots of people, life slowed down, and we could almost sense the earth, taking a deep breath. We saw wildlife in places that it hadn't been seen for years. The air quality improved palpably. And I think quite a few people realized that we could do with less of many things, both material and social. We didn't have to, buy a new suit or a new pair of shoes every 6 months. Obligatory social affairs, the company Christmas party actually was kind of a bore, and it was a relief not to have to go to it. So, so there was general reflection on our consumptive habits and a sort of sense that we could retract a little bit, and it might be better for us spiritually, and it might be better for the earth in terms of our consumption of resources. On the not so light side, there was a lot of economic dislocation, of course. Many small businesses, and especially restaurants, music venues, and the like, just absolutely closed down, and many of them will not come back. It's clear. There was a lot of social isolation, felt most acutely among the young. There was a spike in suicides and drug overdoses, and there was, while there was overall a reduction in crime, in certain areas there were striking increases in violent crime, in murders. So all of these were the sort of the dark side of the pandemic. Now, in the midst of the pandemic, there was a major shift in American discourse. I know I keep using the term American, and I'm talking about the U.S. U.S. discourse on race and racism that was triggered by the murder of George Floyd. We know, that this was just one of many killings of Black Americans by the police over the years, past years, and by the way, since George Floyd was murdered in May of last year. However, this particular one was captured on video, and it was particularly graphic and clear that that this was not one of these situations where the police felt that they were in danger, had to make a split-second decision, pull the trigger, they saw something in a suspect's hand and it, turned out later to be a cell phone, not a gun, but they thought it was a gun, that kind of thing. No, this was one in which the police officer kneeled on George Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes. And we all saw it. So this had a very significant impact on public consciousness about police violence and about the broader phenomena of white privilege and structural or systemic racism. And it tied into the pandemic, again, in the discussion about the differential rates of infections and deaths among Black people and people of color. And there was lots of introspection about racism in our daily lives. Excuse me. There were mass demonstrations. 15 million Americans participated in Black Lives Matter organized demonstrations last summer. That is the largest mass movement in American history. And apparently, by some measures, 70% of the participants in those demonstrations were white. Now, let me turn to the national elections in November of last year. So there's little doubt at all, that Trump's chaotic and flagrantly incompetent management of the pandemic was a major factor in his decisive loss of the presidency, and maybe the sort of mind-bogglingly incompetent treatment was exemplified in that incident when he speculated about cleansing one's body with bleach internally. The Democratic Party obviously prevailed at the presidential level, also regained the scant majority in the Senate. However, Democrats lost seats in the House of Representatives and now still holds a majority, but a very narrow majority. Trump, although he lost, earned 74 million votes. And it is simply unbelievable to his critics, to his opponents, that he could come this close to re-election despite all of the incompetence and the terrible things that he did as president. So while it is a huge relief to Trump critics that he lost, it is of nearly equal concern that Democrats, and especially progressive Democrats, didn't have anything like the performance that they expected and hoped for. There had been talk of what was referred to as a blue, meaning Democratic wave, a blue wave. The blue wave didn't happen. So where do we stand now with the pandemic and otherwise? As you, I'm sure, know, Trump contested and tried to overturn the election results despite no evidence of election irregularities whatsoever. And despite that absence of evidence, there was a genuine and sincere sense of outrage by his followers that the election actually had been stolen. And that fury, stoked by Trump and his minions, all led up to the rally and the storming of the Capitol building on January 6th. Now, this was an outrageous thing, something that we in the United States have not seen in our lifetimes. Maybe we had similarly outrageous, colorful events early in our history, but not for a very long time. And it brought about a momentary sense of outrage and sobriety that crossed the political spectrum. However, that unity of criticism of what occurred on January 6th has been quickly dissipating. And Republican politicians who had criticized Trump's instigation of the crowds on January 6th have either retreated from their criticism or have been ostracized by their party. According to a recent poll, fully 69% of Republican voters actually believe that the election was stolen. And Republican-controlled state legislatures, which are empowered to set the rules for how elections are conducted in their states, including for federal offices, are passing very tight restrictions on voting, whereas Democrats are attempting to pass national legislation that would force states to meet minimum voting standards. In other words, the Republicans have recognized that a broader franchise is actually to their disadvantage, and so they are trying to restrict voting as much as possible and are passing laws which have differential impact on people of color and working class people. And Democrats are trying to keep the process, keep voting open and unrestricted. Fights over masking and quarantine requirements are being replaced now by a tussle over vaccines, with many Republicans refusing to be vaccinated. Democrats are very concerned with a number of anti-democratic structural aspects of our government. These include our Supreme Court, our Electoral College, the possibility of statehood for the District of Columbia, where the capital is, and Puerto Rico. They're talking about reforms of Senate rules. All of this discussion about anti-democratic aspects of our system are being considered. There's also an internal struggle within the Democratic Party between progressives and centrists. For the most part, President Biden has pursued progressive domestic policies, but not so with foreign policy. And the tensions right now between progressive Democrats and centrist Democrats are playing out over the response to Israel's attack on the Gaza Strip going on right now. Progressives are insisting on a harder line with respect to Israel, insisting on the imposition of a ceasefire, whereas the centrists and Biden himself are essentially allowing Israel a free hand. Now, as back to the pandemic, tensions over it are abating, are diminishing right now as infection rates and hospitalizations and deaths are all diminishing. Overall, I think the sense is that Biden has handled the vaccine rollout quite competently, and his approval rating is at 63%, which is quite high. But there is still a great deal of unease and fear that we are not quite free of the grip of the virus. So we look ahead with some hope and a lot of fear, not confident that we are the nation that we thought we were, and with a political system that may not be competent to the huge challenges ahead of us. U.S. politicians are famous for ending their speeches with the phrase, "God bless America." The more appropriate ending for these days would likely be, "God help America." Thanks. I look forward to our discussion.
The streets of Niterói are baking, feel like my whole body's aching, don't know how much more I have to give.